IVM.
We would like to thank Storytel for sponsoring this show. Storytel is an audiobook platform that lets you hear hundreds of thousands of stories on your mobile, on your PC, wherever you prefer. You can get a great deal by signing up at the URL storytel.com/IVM. So this week I'm going to recommend Watership Down by Richard Adams. It's a quirky book. It's the story of a group of rabbits, how they face the destruction of their den and subsequent escape and journey to their new home. It's funny, it's heartwarming, really cool. It's basically Exodus with rabbits. I think you'll enjoy it if you haven't read it before. And let me tell you a little bit about where you can go get it. Go get it at storytel.com/IVM. And you know what will happen? If you go and sign up on this link, you'll get your first month for just 99 rupees a month instead of $299. That's $200 off. Go get this book right now. You'll really enjoy it.
You can build story upon story on the contract farming narrative. It can be made as the most benign thing that is to visit the farming community. It can also be demonized to a level where you could say your farms or your land will be taken away. Truth lies elsewhere. That type of presenting as the most beneficial thing to farmers or demonizing it to say farmers' land can be taken over by corporates, that's not where its danger lies. What does contract farming do? It takes away the fundamental right of farmers to grow what he wants in his farm.
Hello and welcome to the Filter Coffee Podcast. We recorded this episode on the 23rd January 2021 when the ongoing farmer protests in India have reached its boiling point, with the tractor rally being planned for the 26th of January, which is India's Republic Day. A lot has been said about these protests. On one end, this is being hailed as an inspiring protest by the farming community against the three acts which were passed in a hurry by the current regime. And at the other end, it is being touted as something fired more by political agenda against the ruling party and not necessarily a protest led by actual farmers. My guest today feels that neither is right and that the real reason lies in the agrarian crisis that has been simmering for over 6 decades in this country. And he will know from his extraordinary vantage point. Tommy Matthew Vadakanjeral grew up in a farming family in Wayanad district of Kerala. He is the founder of the Fair Trade Alliance in Kerala, which is a farmer collective of over 4,000 farmers in the Western Ghats of India, which is engaged in environmentally sensitive stewardship of the soil, driven by biodiversity, food security, and gender justice. But the reason Tommy is also the best person to speak on this subject is that he is also an entrepreneur. He is the head of a corporation, an FMCG company, if you may, a category that has been unequally vilified in the discourse around these protests. Elements, which is his company, is a successful business endeavor which is deeply anchored on organic and fair trade principles. Welcome to the Filter Coffee Podcast, Tommy. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Karthik?
All good.
I'm as good as Kerala weather allows now, but it's perfect here.
Where are you talking to us from?
Well, I'm in the Kannur district in a place called Ullikal, which is fairly remote, so I hope the net connections work okay for you. It should, by all accounts. But it's, what we call the hinterlands of, Kannur.
The hinterlands of Kerala is a fantastic place for us to talk about what we are going to talk about, I guess. So just setting context to this conversation, Tommy. The 2020-2021 Indian farmers protest, which is ongoing, is an ongoing protest against 3 farm acts which were passed by the Parliament of India in September 2020. So farmer unions and their representatives have demanded that all 3 laws be repealed entirely and that they will not accept anything short of it. Farm leaders have rejected a Supreme Court of India stay order on the farm laws, as well as the involvement of a Supreme Court appointed committee. If I'm not wrong, I think 9 or 10 rounds of talks have taken place. between the central government and the farmer protests as we speak, from the 14th of October till date, I guess. Right? And all of them, safe to say, have been inconclusive. Rather than start with these acts, I wanted to talk to you about the larger agrarian crisis of India and how exactly we got here.
First, a fact check. The Supreme Court of India has not stayed the farm laws. The Supreme Court India has kept in abeyance its implementation. Big difference between staying a law or an act and keeping its implementation in abeyance. So just a factual, correction there. But I think, where you've pitched it, trying to see how did we get here is probably a very important reckoner. I would say how we got here in the short term, but I think it's as much important to know how we got here in the long term as well. In the short term, how we got here has to do with three interventions in Indian reality that has been the handiwork of the present ruling dispensation. And three of them have had grave consequences on the economic fortunes and well-being of the country. The first was the demonetization that took place. Now, while it affected everyone, while it affected the economy as a whole, rural India has been particularly hit while delegitimizing 87% of legal tender in the country. It wanted Indian public to catapult themselves to a digital economy. Now, the one segment that would have found it the most difficult to do that is the rural agrarian base. So they were already, in terms of demonetization, already feeling a huge brunt and feeling almost disenfranchised from economic life. And then you had, soon after that, the GST, the one nation, one tax rule. Now, again, negotiating through the labyrinth of a new tax code was the most difficult again for the rural agrarian base of the country. So these two measures critically impacted on how rural India was going to survive or cope. It was not a matter of time. It was a clear situation where there was a segment of the population that was not just incapacitated, but was almost moved away from negotiating as normal human beings in the nation's economic activity. And it affected their living and wherewithal to a large extent. And finally, we come to, against the backdrop of this level of, difficulties that the rural farming community was going through, you land up with a nationwide lockdown. Again, announced at 4 hours notice. Now, what did that lockdown mean for rural India? Don't forget, in the 7 decades of our independent India's life, what we have consistently driven is migration from rural areas to the urban centers. So it was what I would call a misappropriation of rural resources to enable a industrialized, urbanized India. And this rural appropriation resulted in hundreds upon thousands of migrants who landed up in these cities, landed up as the marginalized segment of the city, landed up as on its fringes, trying to eke out a living by servicing the city. They had exactly 4 hours when every bit of avenues of any economic activity for them was stopped to get back to their villages. So you had this, what I don't have to, explain in detail, this massive exodus of people who trudged 100 kilometers, some 1,000 kilometers to reach back. So you have three of these monumental, decisions that wreaked havoc on the agrarian community. And then in September, you presented to them what was touted as a life-changing legal intervention, legislative intervention that will change their fortunes phenomenally for the better. And even a cursory glance at those legislations suggested that there indeed was nothing in it for farmers.
Why don't we actually take a cursory glance at all the three acts? I think the first one is the Essential Commodities Amendment Act, which largely talks about doing away with the centre's power to impose stockholding limits, or as we refer to it, hoarding. The second one is the Farmer Produce Trade and Commerce Act, which largely talks about the freedom of choice to sell to anyone, anywhere, which also brings into question the seeming dismantling of APMCs, which is also referred to as mandis in most parts of the country. And the third is the Farmer Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Act, which in a nutshell talks about contract farming. But in your opinion, what is happening today is not a direct knee-jerk reaction to these acts, but an outburst of frustration that's been bottled over many, many decades, which, in your opinion, has also peaked in the last 4 to 5 years. Is that right to say?
Those bottled up anger, frustration, that came out in the form of the present agitation. But if this can be seen as the short-term, backdrop of the present farmers' protest, I think it's also important in some manner to keep in mind what is it historically. I don't want to get into that very well-known, term for the divide, which is India versus Bharat. India as in the urbanized, industrialized India, and Bharat as the rural, agrarian India. I think it's probably becoming increasingly problematic to classify it that way. Let's, for the sake of common understanding, keep it as urban, industrialized, modernized, militarized India, and the rural, agrarian India. Our modernity project, our nation-building project, our post-independence economic trajectory has all been anchored on rural appropriation for the sake of this urban El Dorado that we were pursuing. So it is not an accident that there was rural, distress. It is a design. For instance, now you have economic pundits openly stating that the contribution of the agrarian economy to Indian GDP has to necessarily come down. So it's by design. It's not considered economically wise to depend on agriculture, handicrafts, artisanal work that happens, that employs 67% or 65% of the population to bolster the economy. We must move into an industrial base. We must move into a service base. We must move into urban economic activity. We must make sure that our population increasingly resides in urban centers. So rural India has paid the price, has bankrolled, in fact, our urbanization project, our industrialization project, our militarization project. So it was extremely important to suppress agricultural commodity prices because you actually wanted an urban middle class that had voice, that had articulation power to remain comfortable with subsidized food grains. I'm giving just one example of this conundrum. But by design, but by policy, and don't forget this cuts across governments. This is not just a question of what the present ruling dispensation has on offer. My point is that the national rebuilding project, the national integration project, the industrialization project, a newfound nation trying to walk up to the committee of the economically industrialized developed nations, had by design an approach that said we must ensure that rural is, or there was a mindset that considered the rural to be backward, the rural to be a weight on the shoulders of a nation that was waiting to fly. So this project is not, a project of 5 or 6 years, or this project that lasted for 7 decades of our life as an independent nation is also finding its cumulative culmination in these farmers' protests. In its most simplest, reckoning, shorn of the legalese, I would say this is a moment when the rural farming community is asserting its citizenship. I think the historical significance of what is happening in Delhi cannot be overstated.
What you're saying is it's not about farmers protesting these 3 acts, but it is about the entire issue of the larger agrarian crisis that's been brewing for all these decades, right? So you're saying it's much more than what it seems.
Yeah, though the immediate provocation could definitely be attributed to the farm laws. Its context is this. It's a discontent that has been brewing for decades upon decades. Its symptoms were there for all to see in terms of rural distress, agrarian indebtedness, of course, desperate measures being taken by farmers. The phenomenon of farmer suicides is not a topic I really want to dwell upon too much, because I think it's a national shame that we have to talk about it even now. And none of the measures that are being or that are introduced to address that crisis is succeeding. It's not succeeding precisely because of the DNA of our nation building project. And therefore, it has to serve that larger narrative of an urban, industrialized, service sector based, export oriented, and of course, as a side narrative of that militarized, strong India. And therefore, within that narrative, you can't address rural appropriation. You can't address farmers' indebtedness, because you can only keep on putting bandages trying to solve that problem. Though there have been bold measures, farm loan waivers that, when it first started, made the economy feel its slight pinch in terms of its, its direction. But they finally, result or end up as this bandage alone, because it has to, whatever measures had to fit into this larger narrative. For the first time, farmers are saying, we do not want to merely fit in.
So I have a lot of questions on that, right? And clearly, you set it up by saying this is not about the present regime. And the way you've defined the problem, this is multiple governments at multiple points in time, right? But I think it is important to sort of zero in on the trigger, which are the 3 acts, because there are so many threads that it's very difficult to make sense of everything that is being said about the issue, right? What I would love, for you is to help us understand, in probably the most simplest of manner, what is happening at this point, right? Now, if I were to focus on these 3 acts, Tommy, if this is the answer, what is the question? What is the problem that the government set out to solve with these 3 acts?
Honestly, I wish this question was posed to the government. Honestly, okay. If your answer were these 3 farm laws, what was the question that you were addressing with these 3 acts? Let's look at all 3 of them, and then it's easy probably to decipher, to untangle this. The 3 acts are, one, of course, has to do with what is called taking away the monopoly of regulated markets where farmers were selling their produce. The APMC, which is the control or markets, by, regulated under committees where there was notionally the minimum support price as and when it was announced being respected to some degree. The law said you don't have to depend on APMCs. People have a right to sell anywhere. That's the way you can word it.
So sorry to interrupt you, but these APMCs are what we refer to as mandis and whatever sandais in the south, etc.
Right? That's right. While it, so to say, it was liberating farmers to sell wherever they want, what it effectively did was to tell the buyers that you can buy irrespective of the APMCs or discarding the APMCs. So, because the farmers have for decades been saying that the APMCs were not effective enough. Now, that is not to be read as saying discard the APMCs. That is to be read as saying strengthen the APMCs. Reduce the distance between my farm gate and the mandi, which meant if you have only 1,000 mandis now, set up 10,000 mandis, which is saying if the terms of trade within the APMCs is still not robust enough, make it robust enough, which is also saying that if you say the trade in these APMCs have to take place at a fixed or at a minimum price, then ensure that it does take place at those prices. So the idea was to strengthen, reinforce, and reactivate the APMCs, not to bypass them or to make them irrelevant altogether. So while it's ostensibly presented as the right of farmers to sell their product wherever they want, its real impact is the right of the buyers, which in this case are the big business, the agribusiness, to buy irrespective of any regulation, restriction, or even suggestions that come from the APMC regulated mandis. Or take the second act. Second act talked of the Essential Commodities Act that put restrictions on the amount of or the volume of certain commodities, essential commodities, that could be hoarded or that could be kept by a trader being taken away. So earlier you had notional, I have to say this, you had notional restrictions on the amount of grains, particularly the essential commodities that could be stocked. Because the idea was that if you stock, if you hoard, and you buy up when the prices are depressed, and then you release into the market when the prices go up. So you had, traders who could play the market with the stocks that their merchant capital allowed them to accumulate. And this would lead to shortage of essential commodities. And therefore, this was put more than anything else as a consumer protection measure. Now, we have said those restrictions do not apply anymore. I would, of course, other than just the generalized statement, nuance it a bit. My point is that, even as things existed now, these restrictions could be easily bypassed by agribusiness. If you were accumulating these commodities, for instance, for value addition, no restrictions exist at the moment. So you could buy wheat, you could buy as much wheat as you want, as long as you were showing that you were stocking up this wheat to produce atta or a host of other things. So there were enough loopholes to already get away from the restrictions or regulations of the Essential Commodities Act.
So agreed that this is not really going to solve the hoarding problem that is plaguing this country. But having said that, it is still a governance under consumer problem, right? How is this a farmer-related issue?
That is because if you leave this field open, then when prices are depressed, you allow agribusiness to buy up as much as they want. And when prices are high, they have every right, or they would definitely, by simple logic, refrain from buying from the market. So you have harvest time when you could keep off because there's commodities coming in, there's a bounty coming into the market, you keep off. There's harvest time when there's a bounty coming into the market, prices come down, you come and buy. And when prices go up, You're not there, you don't want, you're not interested. So that's from the farmer's point. But do not forget the most other critical part is a farmer is also a consumer. I grow cotton, but I have to buy wheat and rice and a host of stuff. I'm not living in a self-sufficient farm which takes care of all of my food requirements. So I still depend. I depend more than anything else on statutory ration. And Essential Commodities Act will also cut at the root of our ration system, of our public distribution system, on which every farmer depends. I might be a farmer who is growing wheat, and therefore I don't buy wheat from the ration shop, but I buy a host of other things. Therefore, it affects me not just as a producer, it affects me as much as a consumer. But yes, the Essential Commodities Act and the dilution of its provisions or the dismantling of its provisions is, you are right, critically a consumer issue. And I think the urban middle class consumer, of course the urban lower middle class and the urban poor, even if they are not farmers, will be extremely badly affected. And which is why this agitation is not just a farmer agitation for farmers' own causes, it's as much for a consumer cause. And then we come to the last bit, which is contract farming. Now, contract farming, you can build story upon story on the contract farming narrative. It can be made as the most benign thing that is to visit the farming community. It can also be demonized to a level where you could say, your farms or your land will be taken away. I think the truth lies elsewhere. That type of, presenting as the most beneficial thing to farmers or demonizing it to say farmers' land can be taken over by corporates, that's not where its danger lies. What does contract farming do? It takes away the fundamental right of farmers to grow what he wants in his farm. In what manner? Not necessarily because the corporates are going to come and tell you, look, you have to grow X or Y crop on your farm. You can't come and say that. But it ties me into contractual obligations. Look at, the story of contract farming to produce potato wafers.
For example, what the likes of PepsiCo does for Lay's and Uncle Chips.
Yes, by the likes of Pepsi, by the likes of other food brands, you must grow a particular seed. You must, harvest it at a particular time. You have to, basically it takes away my autonomy as a farmer. And there's a huge emotional issue there, which I don't think an urban, middle class readily recognizes. Oh, what's the problem? If he doesn't like it, he doesn't have to sign it. Try saying that to a village where 50 people have signed up and the others haven't. Try saying that to a situation where you have GM crops surrounding, the indigenous variety of seed that you're growing in your farm. Try saying that where inputs is supplied by agribusiness and that input affects that farming village in its entirety. So contract farming, its demonization in terms of, dispossessing farmlands may be an overstatement, though, I would say overstatements very often are probably premonitions of what is to come. And therefore, I wouldn't rule out that, I wouldn't dismiss those overstatements. But yes, the intent of the act the letter of the act does not say it. But the intent of where agriculture is headed is clearly built into that act, which is smallholder farmers are the problem. Therefore, if we cannot aggregate land, let's aggregate cultivation. Let's aggregate cultivation, unleash, agribusiness power into villages, and make sure that swaths of rural India grow products that only the agribusiness wants. Now, this will cut also at the root of household food security. Because I grow X crops for the market, I grew, several times more crops in very small quantities for my own consumption. The kitchen was a nerve center of what I call a homestead farming economy. That entire homestead farming economy will be torn to shreds under contract farming regulations. Of course, you're right, I can keep away. But imagine when you have already unleashed corporate power on to dismantling the APMC and creating buyers in your village. You've unleashed corporate power by making sure there is no fig leaf of a legal, sanction against hoarding commodities. And then you find contract farming coming in, stepping in. It's almost like, look at the chronology. You have APMCs dismantled, you have Essential Commodities Act thrown out of the window, and then say, okay, you can't survive by both of these helpless farmers. Here is the agribusiness savior landing up. Please do contract farming for him. After all, the price is fixed. In terms of what that contract farming does, we really need to read fine print. But one fine print that the farmers have, already waved as a red flag is extremely important. It says if there is a dispute in the implementation of this contract, then I can't take recourse to courts. That's the last basic right that rested with me. That if I sign a contract with agribusiness, if he goes bust or he changes his idea or his product has no more takers and he says, thank you very much, I thought I would buy up all these potatoes, but now I don't, I can't.
That seems to be a very odd thing to have. Right? Is there a very uniquely Indian situation? Do you know, Tommy, any other country which has a situation like that where you can't take a recourse to court?
Usually, to say that something is beyond adjudication is bypassing the rule of law. You can say there has to be steps to adjudication. There has to be arbitration, there has to be negotiation, there has to be mediation, and you create, structures, bodies, institutions, mechanisms for that. But to say that at any point when any of that does not work, I have to, find, succor from the legal system. That is a first probably. That you can, if I run a company and I get into, issues there, of course I will go first to the company law board. But if I'm aggrieved there, if let's say, I'll give you an excellent parallel for this. There was this huge issue with the Tatas in terms of governance and ownership and, ousting a, chairman and managing director. Do not forget the company law board ruled in favor of the, of the then chairman and managing director who was ceremoniously or unceremoniously, exited. It's a mystery. Now, if you had to say, look, this will be, company arbitration will rest with the company law board and NCLT, the National Company Law Board Tribunal, and that's the final. Today, you would have Mr. Mistry remaining or being re-inducted as chairman and managing director of Tata Sons. Come on, if the Tata Sons have this protection, you mean to say helpless farmers cannot have this protection? Where, what logic or what travesty is that?
So clearly in each of the acts, there are contentious issues. But why not fine-tune them? Are the farmers coming across as inflexible and unrealistic through this all or nothing approach?
No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, that's a trap that the government is playing in its negotiations. And to their eternal credit, the farmer leaders have deflected it and said no. This is like saying, get to the details and say X, Y provisions you do not like. Therefore, we will tinker with that and let these remain. Which is why, this question of, adamancy comes up. Why are the farmers adamant? Let's discuss these three acts close by close. And if there are, provisions there that you do not like, we will try and, amend or tinker with that. That's exactly what the Supreme Court is also saying by other means. And why the farmers having fallen for that is very clear. This time, we are saying, give us stakes. This time, it's not about X clause you don't like, we will change that. Which is why intent is extremely important. Don't come back to us to say, we will change 5 provisions, all is well. After all, there is give and take. My point is, what is give and take in this situation? There's no give and take in saying you should remain disenfranchised. There's no give and take in a situation where rural appropriation should continue unabated. There's no give and take, therefore, exactly in a situation where we say it's not enough to scrape these 3 laws. Take them out of we are saying take them out of the frame. And then, after taking them out of the frame, come back to the original ground for our protest. Come back to the original issue of agrarian distress. Come back to the original issue where we trudged hundreds upon hundreds of kilometers to reach Mumbai in Maharashtra, to reach Jaipur or other locations in Rajasthan, to reach the national capital itself twice earlier. Discuss the critical issue then, which is the minimum support price. And the minimum support price is, I think it's not understood in its ramifications. It's probably presented as, sustenance for farmers in distress. Oh my God, it takes a untold human labor to produce this wheat and it's being sold for a pittance. Can we make sure that it's at least sold for XYZ price? That's not where the minimum support price logic rests. In its broad sweep, the minimum support price is saying, give us our stake in the Indian economy. Because the minimum support price does call for substantial economic allocation, substantial budgetary allocation. It's not a tinkering issue.
What do you mean by budgetary allocation?
Well, you will have to, once you make it a statutory obligation, you will have to make sure that the government procurement that you do has to be at minimum support price. The corporate agri-businesses who have to buy a commodity will have to respect the minimum support price. And yet you will have to make sure that in a country like ours, the impoverished, hungry millions have to be fed. So if you have to buy at a certain price, but make sure that food reaches the tables of millions upon millions of Indians, then you need a government that believes food is a basic right. So you have the right to food and the right to farming as an activity coming together. Of course, you will have to say there is a stake, there is an allocation and budgetary allocation at that has to happen if we have to make this possible. But that is already the norm in other sectors. Don't forget. When you say that there has to be a minimum wage, when you say that industrial workers have to be paid gratuity, provident fund, other social security measures, you are basically saying that these have to fall upon the government and the corporates as their legal responsibility. And which is why there is hundreds upon hundreds of, or thousands upon thousands of crores of rupees that go in to support these activities, which is why there are export benefits, which is why there are, tax exemptions, which is why there are startup incentives. You look at every bit of the economic activity or the economic sphere that we say is robust and thriving, and you see the amount of, fiscal allocations by budgetary provisions that the government allots to these activities. And that is being bankrolled by the farmers. And not yesterday and day before yesterday, but for 70 years. Finally, the economic pie is defined. If from that you allocate for your urban service sector industrial project the lion's share of the pie, obviously what is required to make this happen will shrink. Which is why the minimum support price is almost philosophical in its ramifications for the way Indian economy, polity, stakeholdership in the nation has to be defined. And these go hand in hand.
I have two questions on this.
Yes.
One is, we're talking about how other sectors are being treated and how it is very different when it comes to the largest part of our economy, which is farming. But there are also the argument that farming has always been subsidized in many forms. A lot of the resources that go into farming, like electricity, are subsidized in many places, etc. Right? How do you feel about that?
I think it's good to put numbers on these subsidies, and the picture that emerges will be quite stark. I will begin with two, basic, issues related to this, and this has to do with how most nations evolved from an agrarian, feudal, base to other forms of economic and social organization. If you did not have rural, agrarian exploitation, feudal in its character, and within the Indian context, caste-based in its character, there wouldn't be agriculture as an activity. Historically, there wouldn't be. So while you didn't have subsidies, what you had was inhuman exploitation. And in all countries, for that matter. In India, we had the additional factor of caste as well. Manorial landlords exploited the rural folk, exploited tenants to the hilt to make agriculture viable as an activity, across the world. Within India, we blessed it, sanctified it with caste as well. So it's that level of inhuman exploitation that made agriculture happen. Now you take away that base. We should take away that base and then make agriculture, which anyway is a necessary human activity, by the way. It produces food. So you can't run away from that. You remove that base. You remove that exploitative base, not that we have removed it in any significant manner, but you take away that base, and then you would find agriculture becomes more than anything else. Farming becomes our commons. Farming does not then become a entrepreneurial business activity where its fortunes are decided by market forces in any and every manner. No. Farming across the world is our commons, which is why the most industrialized of nations have such phenomenal agricultural subsidies. It's baffling to note its volume and its character. For instance, there are countries where you submit the bill or the receipt of the product of your agri-produce, and exactly the same amount is put into your account. I grow for 1,000 rupees, I go and sell it in the market, I submit the bill saying I have sold for 1,000 rupees, an equal amount comes to my account. That's price support. But does it stop there? No. In Switzerland, for instance, I get a benefit for maintaining the Swiss landscape to promote tourism. And also because that landscape is considered the common heritage of Switzerland. So you have a agrarian subsidy for your produce, which is 100%, or a doubling of farm income merely on that count. And then you have this huge incentive that you get because the fact that you maintain pasture lands is important for the ecology, for landscape, for other economic activities that this landscape, engenders, and the rights that go with it. So you add up all of this, and then you find that agriculture cannot be considered, of course, a business activity alone. But if you must, then at least the Indian, farmers are saying, at least consider us on par with other regular business activity. Or do not ask us to bankroll your food programs. You drive you drive millions upon millions into the urban hinterland and then say they must have rice at X, at a particular price. By all means. That's because the economic trajectory that you followed has its disastrous consequences in terms of impoverishing millions. But to contain the anger of the impoverished millions, you bring in, of course, a food security. It is an absolute must. Don't ask us, the farmers, to foot that bill. That's a national cause. Food must be available. It must be available free or at extremely nominal cost. But that must be footed from the national exchequer. At the moment, what you do is you foot it nominally from the national exchequer. The rest of it, you actually bankroll by depressing our prices. And that is why the Swaminathan Commission was very clear. It's a realistic reckoning of the actual cost of production. Now, everyone says they're implementing the MSP, but nobody says whether you are implementing or you are declaring a minimum support price, not implementing, you're declaring a minimum support price for a few, crops, but you never go upfront to say, by what formula are you declaring this minimum support price? A celebrated committee has given its recommendations of the formula to be followed. It has never been implemented even once. It has never been implemented with respect to a single crop.
Why is that so? Why do you feel it has never been implemented?
Because it's easier to dump it on the misfortunes of farmers. Because if it is implemented, agribusiness has to buy at a particular rate, government procurement has to be at a particular rate, and that will, by normal logic, make food unaffordable for teeming millions. Instead of the national exchequer, our fiscal policy taking care of this inherent dichotomy in its planning and direction, we are saying, let's look at a mute segment of our population who would bear this burden and then dig their own grave or commit, or end their own lives. But that's something for statisticians to look at. This project will continue unabated. The MSP call, therefore, I repeat, is the most significant of these farm agitation's demands. It says, we want to be stakeholders.
You almost sound like there is an agenda against farmers by the government. Do you genuinely believe this? And if you were to compare, what the MSP should be, according to the Swaminathan Committee, how low are the current procurement prices? I ask this because you recently mentioned in an article that the current MSP issue is a quintessentially fair trade movement.
Yeah, first of all, I must say, I'm not somebody who would say there's an agenda of the government. Those are the words I'm a little cautious about using. What happens is that every ruling dispensation has taken the easy way out. Because, at the end of the day, 67% or 65% of the population is a politician's dream. So he would want to keep them humored. So the fact is that you can actually, pull the wool over their eyes and still, get what you want. So it's not so much an agenda as in a government agenda to impoverish people. The problem is there's an agenda about national, what we call this quote within quotes word called development. What is considered development? What are the signifiers? What are its large symbols? Your skyscrapers, to your airports, to your 8-lane roads, to your urban conglomerates. All of these seem to be understood as development. And since you're pursuing that idea of development, it has to create its refugees. It has to create its victims. And for 7 decades, these victims have been the rural populations or significant segment of it. I'm not saying there's no urban poor. Of course, that's a massive problem and an increasingly, increasing in numbers problem. But coming back to your pointed reference to my recent articulation that the farmers' agitation in India is a fair trade moment. The fair trade concept, I think, is almost implicit in the word itself. The trade, that exchange of goods and services, that commodity exchange has to be on fair terms. But fair trade as a practice is probably about 5 decades old. Fair trade as an organized, regulated system of trading is about 3 decades old. And one of the cardinal principles of that is to make sure that the primary producers of goods receive a price that is at least commensurate with its cost of production. And we define cost of production a little more rigorously to say cost of sustainable production. Because you can simply reduce cost of production by making it unsustainable. I can overexploit groundwater and produce a bounty, and then that land is degraded, that nothing else grows there. So the cost of sustainable production must be met when that product is exchanged. In its practice, of course, it has its own vicissitudes, it has its own negotiation with a market that does not respect those rules. Its labeling systems are still struggling to find shelf space in supermarkets in several developed countries. But through it all, the principle is that agricultural commodities, particularly those commodities that are mass, marketed, commodities that, where there's haulage of containers upon containers of these, like coffee and cocoa and other cotton and other products. In those products, this trading system says, look, buy this product vis-a-vis something else that is sitting on your shelf, because the primary producers of these products have received a price that is commensurate with its cost of production. Now, how right, how exact is that claim? Is it really commensurate with its cost of production? Are all matters of detail, where we will have lots of issues to discuss and put the microscope on. But the principle is this. But this system of trading has always remained what I would say a tiny little stream in an ocean of unfair commerce. There's a global unfair commodity commerce happening. And in that, there is, alongside or somewhere there's a small stream of fair trade, which meant these fair trade production segments are basically small icebergs rather than, replicable models that make world trade, more fair. Therefore, you have, for instance, 2,000 million euros, the big numbers touted as the value of fair trade. But against this gigantic global trade, that is still tiny. But the second largest or the second most population in the world, the country that hosts the second most population in the world, is saying there must be a minimum support price for our primary agricultural produce. That is like saying the MSP is akin to the fair trade minimum price. The minimum support price that farmers are demanding is in many ways, or probably is as close akin to the FTMP or fair trade minimum price. That is voluntary, or it's appealing. The fair trade minimum price and goods and services that guarantee that the fair trade minimum price has been paid is still appealing to consumers' conscience to pick them up vis-a-vis an unfair product. So there is a fair trade coffee and there's a Nescafe sitting side by side. It's appealing to your good conscience to say, pick up this fair trade coffee vis-a-vis the Nescafe that is sitting next. But for the first time, a country, the second most populous country in the whole world, is saying, make MSP the norm, which means mainstream fair trade. Mainstream fair trade because across the world, rural agrarian communities have been deprived of their stake in the economic pie. India is its starkest example to date because its manifestations are in hundreds upon thousands of farmers ending their lives because they cannot cope indebtedness. And it's from that very abyss of unfair trade that one of the most radical slogans about, addressing rural distress has come up, which is make MSP the rule. And make MSP the rule in the light of all the, beating that concept has suffered in its implementation in this country in the last several decades, where it has become a notion rather than a felt reality for farmers. So we are saying across crops, across agrarian produce, and with a legal guarantee that makes it illegal to trade in agri-commodities below the minimum support.
No, I was just thinking as you were talking, it's an extraordinarily significant moment, right? Like I always felt that the fact that there is a fair trade movement also means that a majority of trade that happens in this world is unfair.
You are right. You're perfectly right. In fact, you know how this word first originated? Of course, there's a lot of folklore about how fair trade and how the concept originated. But one thing that is huge currency in the UK is when the very well-known Michael Barrett Brown, in a meeting on development, stood up to say, there's so much unfair trade in the world. And then it almost instinctively came out of him, we need fair trade. Michael Barrett Brown is no more. He's the one of the founders of that iconic organization called TWIN, which is Third World Information Network. He was part of the Greater London City Council that was dismantled by Margaret Thatcher, but which tried to rejuvenate urban life in London. The old mayor of London, King Livingstone, sort of initiated that. The whole history behind that, and of course several other efforts by several other organizations, collectives, communities to have trade justice as an intrinsic part of its relationship with communities in the developing world. Now, of course, there is local fair trade. There is, dairy farmers in the UK or in France who says, but our plight is exactly the same. Our dairy produce actually needs a bit of fair trade too. There's local fair trade, there's solidarity trade, the rainbow, hues of the trade justice movement is too much to recount in a conversation like this. But suffice it to say that at its heart is this principle that people who produce a product, and its most evocative, symbol being smallholder farmers, must receive a price that is commensurate with the cost of sustainably producing that. And that big demand is what this agitation is touting as its biggest demand.
That also exemplifies the historic moment whose doorstep we are probably at, right? Like if a country like India with the second largest population can actually make that the rule and not the exception, then probably we are setting a precedent in the entire global fair trade movement. Right? How likely is that to happen?
I'm extremely optimistic. Not because I want to give myself into rant and optimism, but from the reality of how much is the destitution, how much is the bottled anger, that probably there isn't a way out for the ruling class. So I'm not saying this as some dream, a pipe dream. Look, how can this happen? Yes, it presents a historic and unique opportunity for the country. In fact, I would say if somebody wants to, leave their signature, onto their governance policy or onto their regime, as it were, they should seize this moment. This is not available. This is an opportunity that doesn't come. And conditions have ripened to a stage where the demand for MSP appears logical across stakeholders, including the conglomerates, including the urban middle class. So in terms of its popular recognition, it has an evocative resonance because it resonates with the urban middle class. It resonates across the board. It says, oh my God, for the type of food that I consume, shouldn't I think of those who produce this? Look at all those slightly romantic and, sometimes simplistic logos and artworks and everything that is, fluttering in the social media regarding the farmers' agitation. If I ate today thanks to a farmer, they're not glib, but they touch at the core of urban middle class understanding what this movement is all about. And that to me is significant. So there is actually a consensus, an increasing national consensus on a fair deal to farmers. And which is why every institution wants to seize upon this moment. The Supreme Court, state legislatures, several, and look at the trading community. They're actively behind this, supporting this all the way. Look at religious organizations that have supported it. So if a ruler or the ruling class or a government, the present government and ruling dispensation, realizes its huge popularity potential, I think they should seize this moment. Because believe you me, you cannot, even if the farmers disperse off, you cannot hide the crisis. It will still come back to haunt you. And it will still manifest itself in a manner that organized economic activity and, of course, organized governance becomes impossible. Not because farmers will be rebellious, but because destitution will reach a stage where it's impossible for your urban industrial products itself to be sold. I can't buy your fridge, your television, your washing machines, your mixie, and everything else that you also depend on this 65% of the population if you want your industry to thrive. So you will need some semblance of income security for the farming communities. It is in your own interest. So very often when people talk of distributing the economic pie, they forget that great economic rebound has happened precisely on that count. When distributive justice has been inducted into the economy, including when the Great Depression was overcome in the US, they piggy rode on distributive justice. You will find a massive rejuvenation of the economy. So it's not as is being presented by the present, neoliberal economic pundits that this will drain the nation's resources and lock away, funds for or waste funds for development. Exactly the opposite is going to happen. You need to increase rural consumption. Of course, what type of consumption, what its impact on not just the economy, but also on the environment are all issues that we can discuss. But distributive justice that underpins economic planning has always resulted in a rebounding of the economy, not its depression.
So let's assume the government does seize the moment and implement the MSP. What will then be its impact on the average consumer? I understand the benefits of redistribution of resources that you mentioned, but at the same time, middle class consumption is equally key to our economic growth, isn't it?
They will have an impact, but let's not forget two things. One, there is what we call the have-nots, the poor, those who cannot afford. We need to make sure that our right to food, policies, programs, actions actually count. There is enough budgetary allocation for that. There's enough national resources for that. So none of this in terms of, a minimum support price or a remunerative price for farmers is going to negatively impact those segments of society that anyway are dependent today or should be protected by state resources, which is the minimum amount of food grains, of rice or wheat or dal, cereals and pulses and cooking oil that have been, that have been considered part of the legal rights of Indians. So that segment is already supposed to be taken care of. Whether we do it good or not is a different matter. It's supposed to be legally taken care of. There is another segment. And that's the segment that I really want to, want us to take notice. What is the number of middle class in India? That's 300 million. What we talk of as a segment that's in the affordable, bracket, which means they can afford their food, they can afford their basic clothing, they can afford their shelter. That number is not small. That's 300 million. 300 million, by the way, is just about the population of Europe as a continent. Now that first world, that urban India that resides within our Bharat, that first world within what we call third world. Now these are categories that I'm wary of using, but comes as part of articulation. So, but that's the first world within our third world, if we could be called, or we should be called a third world. They need to pay their dues. For heaven's sake, they have to pay their dues. In any case, 3-4 generations, and their forefathers were in the rural, hinterlands of India. We are an agrarian economy. It doesn't only mean that, there was those in the rural bases were frozen in rural areas and you had a drop from, skies urban population in this country. No. Cities grew with influx of population from rural areas. And of course, and it's not just a locational issue of urban and rural in terms of, cities and villages. It is also an issue of location by the mind. But 300 million middle class in India is the population of a continent. That continent within this Indian continent must pay their dues. Can food ever be as cheap as it is being offered to them today? I think a UGC professor, now that's not a category I'm referring in vain, I hope, must be able to look at, or people who draw salaries at that level, even people who draw much lesser salaries, must be able to say what is the percentage of their income component that is spent on food. And very often that you realize their socialization cost, their entertainment cost, their grooming cost, their cosmetic expenditure. You bring in all of those expenses and then you say how much do they pay on food as in staples that they bring into their kitchens. And you realize it is not in any manner commensurate with how food should be treated, how food should be priced, what you should pay for your food. So this reorganizing of the budgets or of the domestic budget of our affordable segment is critical.
Tommy, I'm a little taken aback by what you just said, because what you're essentially saying is the reverse of popular perception, which is that the farming sector has been disproportionately subsidized over the ages. But what you're saying is that it is actually the middle class that has been subsidized for decades, and that needs to be reversed because it is unsustainable. Even
as we make sure that our our public distribution system is strengthened and really made to ensure that no one goes hungry. So these go hand in hand. We need to ensure that our public distribution system addresses the hunger and the malnutrition prevalent in this country. But at the same time, we need to make sure that the middle and upper middle class of our country, whose numbers are swelled by this rural appropriation, and I want that guilt feeling to sink in some manner, though that's not the most polite way of putting it. But don't forget, this has been created at the cost of the rural agrarian populations.
So what you're essentially saying is a correction needs to happen to reverse what has been happening for over 70 years.
My point is, I'm not saying it's too radical a correction. Some of these changes happen because you've reached a dead end. There's no option. You can't go beyond. Or, you've reached a stage where you have to course correct in a manner that reorganizes economic activity. And that happens. It happens under, dire straits or under, other compulsions. And it's not radical because of its potential to disrupt alone. Its potential to rekindle, revamp, and rejuvenate is what we need to harp upon.
So if this is such a universal problem, why does it seem like only the farmers in Punjab and Haryana are today protesting, and that the farmers in the south, the west or the east seem to be a little bit indifferent to this? Is that even an accurate way of stating the truth?
That's actually because your television cameras have only that reach till the fringes of Delhi. Otherwise, no. As I speak to you today, there is at least 2,000 protest spots in Kerala. There is at least 20 or 30 farmers' organizations that have one action or other every day. And on top of it, you have about 2,000 plus farmers from Kerala who have actually reached Delhi borders. You look at this across, you will find, while we need a focus point to rivet the national attention onto this, and therefore the siege of the capital is important and we will maintain it. If you think your ability or crowd management techniques that can take care of 100 or 200,000 people that have assembled on the entry points of Delhi will solve this issue for you, you're mistaken. Because you look at and I think it's important to read vernacular press if you want to really understand what's happening and where it is happening. And don't forget the political class who have their ears to the ground when it comes to either potential or discontent have got the message very clear. Therefore, all of them are paying lip service by in one way or the other. They understand this can make or break fortunes. The state elections that are around the corner will have to reckon with the farmers' agitation as the most important issue that they will have to explain to people or take a stand on at the hustings. So that is happening. I don't think it is even remotely realistic to say this is a phenomenon, limited to Punjab, Northern India, Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan. No, do not forget the Maharashtra farmers. Their historic march to Bombay 2 years ago captured national imagination.
And of course, that is in line with how you started off by saying that this is not about just the three acts, but what has been happening for a while. So in that front, then even the protest of the Tamil Nadu farmers in Delhi, which largely went mostly unreported, is also a part of the same protest.
It is part of the same protest. The Karnataka Rajya Raita Sangha, for instance, in Karnataka, this Tamil Nadu, which many people have heard because they have brought in a lot of drama and spectacle to the agitation, and it is important. Spectacle is extremely important. But Karnataka Rajya Raita Sangha, founded by the legendary Nanjundaswamy, is out in the street every day, and those numbers are not symbolic in activists numbers of 30 and 40. There are thousands of farmers who are on the streets and who are marching and who are taking out protests and who are standing solidly behind the agitation. But yes, if you do it across the country, as we have done in the past, you don't, the urban media, I don't want to use the term that the farmers are using for that now, but the urban media, your camera reach is, extremely limited, and therefore it records, yeah.
Having said that, isn't it also true that some of the South Indian governments, most notably Kerala and Tamil Nadu, have been awake to this crisis for a while, and over many decades actually have even tried to minimize its impact through various measures?
I wouldn't say they've taken efforts to minimize the impact of this. I think they have recognized, both these governments have recognized it's, the stakeholdership of this community better than, several other governments. But come GST, and there is nothing within the resource, within the kitty of state governments to address this on their own. And therefore, we have situations where many of their intentions have not been implemented. Not, just by the resource issues alone. For instance, look at typically the Kerala situation. Now, we don't have the APMC or mandis in Kerala, but we have had, government procurement as a sort of fallback system for a very, very long time. And there is always the need to, or there's always pressure, there's always noise, made to make sure that it actually works. If you have, a resource crunch, or if you have misplaced, priorities, then it would mean that while you procure rice at the moment, for instance, you procure paddy probably at the highest price in the country. It's today in the new budget 28 rupees. It was 27.60 in the previous year, which means the last crop was procured at 27 rupees 60 paise. But if you sit on an empty treasury, then that money could take several months in coming. And if that happens, the farmer who has to get this price to pay off debts, to take care of basic expenses, to pay for healthcare expenses, to take care of educational expenses, or things that contingencies that fall upon him, will end up selling this rice at half that price to the local market. And there are enough players waiting to pounce on that, which is why the APMC story is important. If we discard our public procurement of rice, I mean, the big agribusiness will laugh all the way to the bank because they will get it at 16 rupees. Now with state government buying it at 27.60, it's very difficult for private players to buy at less than that price. But they're waiting for the government plan to falter so that they can get it at 16, 17 rupees. And that trade is happening in Kerala even as we speak. And it's, of course, all of it is not because by design the state treasury is empty. It's also that, in many ways, this logic of, your spending priorities is impacting upon the left front government in Kerala as well. So those things does happen. But yes, if you want to take a cue about whether these things are possible, please do look at Kerala and Kerala, Tamil Nadu, with all the caveats.
Right. And of course, in Tamil Nadu, the point that you had made earlier, which is bringing the farmer and the market closer, was also impacted by the Uravar Sandais, which is the farmer markets that happened. Where the farmer was able to bring it to the market and sell it himself or herself. Tommy, I want to end with a question that is in all our minds. Throughout this protest and the discourse around it, there's been a special vilification of large corporations, corporates, as they call it, like as though they're a special breed of people, while, as we know, it's just a legal representation of any group. Firstly, is this justified? Secondly, why I'm asking you this is because you use the examples of great subsidies that are given to farmers in EU and USA, etc. Why I'm asking you this is you used examples of great subsidies given to farmers, especially in Europe and America. But these are also places where big corporations thrive in the food industry. So my question to you is, firstly, is everything okay in those markets? Would you classify them as a very healthy ecosystem between corporations, farmers, and the citizenry? And if yes, are we needlessly fearing large corporations and their impact? I'm asking you this because you're not just a champion of fair trade. You're also an entrepreneur and you run Elements, which is a company that is walking the talk on fair trade practices.
First of all, it's not okay at all in places like the United States. Conscientious consumers there describe, swathes of, terrain there as food deserts. And they are called food deserts not because they don't grow food. They are called food deserts because there's no sustainable food to be sourced in businesses. So if you have only a Walmart where you can go and buy food, and you don't have local food cooperatives that offer you smallholder produce, that offer you sustainably produced food, that offer you organic food, then that terrain, that whole region is called a food desert. Now, this is the issue that corporates have to. Corporates in popular parlance. Now, there is corporate as a legal entity where I could say I have registered a private limited company, therefore I am a corporate. I am a body corporate. But corporate in popular parlance, is used interchangeably with big business and big business that is not socially committed. Now, both those go together. But a food co-op, which is a cooperative, is still a corporate in that sense, by legal definitions. Or an organic store. Or at one time, the Whole Foods that has been now brought over by Amazon. Yeah, but Whole Foods, in its origin, was addressing this problem of the food desert, that there isn't sustainable food there. So I think if you really want to look at, what is the impact of corporatization of not just agriculture, but of our food supply chain, then I think agribusiness models emanating from the West are clearly not the place to look at. It's disastrous. Its impact, not just on food, on supply chain equity, but more than anything else, on food waste and the larger question of the environmental devastation that type of food, that promoting that type of food consumption causes, have to be, taken on board. But if you really want to see how a business can meaningfully enter this, then you look at a lot of businesses that have sprung up around sustainable food, sourcing from the local communities, making sure that those producers get a fair price for their products, making sure it's sustainably grown, making sure it's toxic free, making sure it takes care of the environment, where it's grown. Take a simple product like honey. Now, honey farmers and big, not big as in brands, yes, big brands, honey brands have taken, the glyphosate issue head on, because Roundup or several Monsanto products are killing off the honeybees. Now, those are businesses that have taken up the cause. They can't be your big corporate as in Walmart, but they are nevertheless businesses that do robust economic activity in local communities. And some of them have brand presence that are pan-USA, for instance. There are several brands that one could talk of. Now, are they making an impact? They certainly are. Are they making an impact to tilt the scales? No, we need to be modest. No, they are not. They are not. But if corporates really want to show that they are responsible corporate citizens, then I think the first thing that they must do is to subject their supply chains to rigorous audit, to rigorous social, environmental, equity audits. Now, these are not new concepts. These are real concepts that exist, that have been tried, that some of them have benchmarked against. Some of them, of course, might do it only to tick the box and to show it in their CSR, credentials page. But there are a lot of businesses that try and do it responsibly. And I think, yes, I have definitely believed that organized businesses that are deeply committed to values are even now equipped to lead society to a better quality of life. And that entrepreneurship will always remain a human urge, whether it is backed by the lure of the lacquer or it's backed by the need to see or to the need to engender peace, health, and happiness. So, which is why, yes, Elements does exist, and it remains one important avenue of my expression. Yes.
Right. And it's important at this point to note that these are not just views, but things that you stand by and walk your talk with the Elements, like the way you source it, the way you run that business.
I hope I will be able to, or I am doing, yeah.
Tommy, thank you so much. It was wonderful to speak with you on this subject.
Thank you indeed, Karthik, and thanks for the engaging time you provided me. And I hope I have been in some manner able to, bring some time or some use to your viewers that will be worth their while.
Absolutely, and I can't wait to talk to you once we're through with the crisis to see how it panned out. Thank you so much. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am _Karthik, that's Karthik with an H, on Twitter, and filter_coffee, that's coffee with a K, on Instagram.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Storytel and The Whole Truth Foods. Thank you for supporting us. We have a new show out this week, Candid Kannan with Siddharth Kannan. Sid K is a well-known RJ. He has an incredible show with some of the most amazing Bollywood celebrities. As part of the first week's episode, we're releasing 5 episodes at one time, so you can get your fill of Sid. You can hear him talk to Varun Dhawan, Anil Kapoor, Anurag Kashyap, Bhumi Pednekar, and a whole lot more. This week on the Edges and Sledges podcast with Varun DJ and Ashwin, hear them talk about the historic victory that India achieved at Gaba. Maruk Inayat had an amazing talk with Gul Panag. They spoke about the farmer protests and why Bollywood celebs are acting the way that they are. And finally, Shunya One is back this week. Sheila Aditya and me talked to Anirudh Singla from Pepper Content. We have a great lineup of guests coming up in the coming weeks, including Deepak Abid, the co-founder of India Gold. Definitely check that out. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Feeling overwhelmed, anxious, struggling with too many obstacles, don't know where your life is headed? Well, if you are dealing with one or all of these, tune into the Positively Unlimited podcast, because in each episode, I share a life lesson, a life hack, a pro tip that can help you get your life back on track. All episodes are available on the IVM website, IVM Podcast app, or wherever it is that you get your podcast from.